Hello and welcome, dear students. In this class, we will talk about global supply chains, arguably the backbone of the global economy, and discuss how they can be made more resilient in times of ongoing crisis. I will argue that greater resilience will also depend on making global supply chains more responsible with regard to labor and environmental standards. It is actually often in times of crisis that consumers start to think about the supply chains behind the goods and services they consume because their fragility and complexity suddenly becomes evident. COVID lockdowns, for instance, caused shortages in many supplies. The sudden rise in demand in products like masks or medicines revealed the geographic concentration of production capacities, which can quickly turn into a risk if that region destabilizes. And trade routes depend on functioning infrastructure, like train racks and roads, and, to a large part, still on fossil fuels. In the current war situation, economic sanctions of Russia and the destruction of land, crops and trade routes in Ukraine threaten the stability of many supplies, from food to almost all export goods relying on fossil fuels for production and transport. If we leave the consumer perspective and shift towards the actors at the heart of global supply chains, businesses and workers, we have to recognize that they are not surprised by these risks. Rather, they have to deal with them on a daily basis. Changes in demand or prices can quickly threaten their existence. During the COVID crisis, for instance, garment workers in the global south were laid off en masse as retailers never paid for their orders. During the current war situation, expediters that deliver our goods daily to supermarkets and shops risk going bankrupt because of rising gas prices for their trucks. In times of crisis, debates about critical infrastructures become louder. Sectors that many would agree need to be protected from these fragilities and risks of global supply chains. And while supply and operations management researchers and practitioners have long been sensitive to risks like the bullwhip effect and have come up with many possibilities for supply chain risk management, in this lecture we look beyond this mere optimization problem towards understanding the political and societal embeddedness of this form of global production. In particular, there are three learning aims. First, I will introduce you to the basic structure of global supply chains by using the example of the garment industry. Second, I will introduce you to some key concepts along which global supply chains are analyzed and will then outline some of their complexities which make them prone to risks and responsibility concerns. Third, and finally, I will offer some reflections about how global supply chains can be made more resilient and responsible. To understand how global supply chains have developed historically, we can look at the garment industry, which was the first truly globalized industry because it is so labor-intensive and requires relatively low skill. Schematically, the garment supply chain breaks down into the following steps: planning the collection, designing and prototyping the models, buying the materials, manufacturing and assembling the fashion items, marketing them, and then distributing them to the retailers. Traditionally, garment or fashion companies would control all of these steps except for the retail, which was done by retailers. In an internationalization process starting on a larger scale in the 1970s, Western garment producers increasingly started to outsource first the assembly and manufacturing part. European garment companies, for example, outsourced to countries in the south of Europe, to North Africa, or to former Yugoslavia. The main drivers to do so were first, trade regulations that incentivized these steps. Second, growing competition from large retailers that began sourcing directly from Asia, especially Hong Kong, at much cheaper prices. And third, and relatedly, a lack of workforce willing to work for the relatively and comparatively low prices this industry pays. In the 1980s, companies began to grow that acted just as so-called full package or full service importers. So these firms controlled the middle part of the supply chain, the buying of the materials, the manufacturing and assembly, and the marketing. And they delivered these to retailers in the West that just put together their collections and then sourced the whole products from those importers. And as a final model in the 1990s and since then the so-called new verticals developed, fast fashion companies like H&M or Zara that actually controlled the whole supply chain very tightly, but that had their main competence in retailing, planning collections, designing collections, and marketing those collections. If we abstract from this specific industry, for firms there are four main motives to outsource or offshore parts of their supply chains. First, market access, either to certain goods or to the labor market, which was a critical issue for the garment industry. Second, efficiency considerations, cutting costs or the ability to focus on core competences, which was a dominant management model in the 1980s, 1990s. Third, gaining access to knowledge and expertise. And finally, escaping regulations and with that certain responsibility concerns. However, these motives are not necessarily the drivers. The real drivers are changes in trade regimes and the resulting competitive dynamics. I already mentioned the WTO entry of China, which drastically changed manufacturing-oriented supply chains. An important facilitator, of course, was and is information and communication technology, without which the required complex coordination on a global scale would not be possible. Let's now move towards unpacking some of the key concepts along which global supply chains are analyzed. First, there are different names for the phenomenon. Global supply chains, global commodity chains, global value chains, global value networks, or global production networks are just some of the terms that you will find in the literature and the debates. The common denominator really among all of these concepts is that global supply chains is more or are more than just the flow of goods. Rather, they are socially constructed and dynamic entities that come with geographical implications, institutional implications, and power and inequality implications. Second, there are different actors. Most importantly, lead firms on the one hand, those focal firms that drive global supply chains and occupy central positions, and suppliers on the other hand. The relationships between lead firms and suppliers and between different suppliers are typically seen as networked. So this means they are neither coordinated fully by market mechanisms nor fully by hierarchical mechanisms, as you heard in lecture 4. Third, the literature distinguishes two main configurations of supply chains. Buyer-driven supply chains on the one hand, in which large retailers such as H&M or Walmart have the most power and drive the supply chain, and producer-driven supply chains where large and integrated suppliers, typically in more technology-intensive industries like the automotive industry, hold a large amount of power. Fourth, supply chains are governed, coordinated, narrowly understood by lead firms, but more broadly understood, and we will talk about this in the second half of this lecture, by regulators and other actors like civil society actors, trade unions, or consumers. Governance analysis allows us to understand how a supply chain is controlled and coordinated, and when certain actors in the chain have more power than others. Gereffi and colleagues distinguish 5 main governance types when looking just at the dyadic relationships between buyers and suppliers at the heart of global supply chains. Market-based governance, modular governance, relational governance, captive governance, and hierarchical governance. Just as an example, in the middle type, the relational form, here we have a constellation where buyers and suppliers have more or less comparable power, and this means they also depend mutually on each other, So the governance is more balanced and more relational, more trust-based. Fifth and finally, supply chains are marked by economic inequality across geographical regions. And an important part of supply chain research has looked at so-called upgrading dynamics, strategies used by countries, regions, and other stakeholders to maintain or improve their positions in the global economy by developing skills and competences that allow them to move further up the supply chain. Building on these concepts, I will now give you 3 reasons for why contemporary supply chains are prone to risks and responsibility concerns. Here, please bear in mind what I said before. The overall underlying dynamic is intense global competition, and therefore many supply chains are built towards maximum efficiency. The first complexity is that when you unpack the stylized supply chain structure you've seen before, you really see the multiple and complex relationships between the different actors. Here again, you see an example from the garment industry. And this example is still a very stylized and simplified depiction. Here you see that we have large garment retailers that have up to 1,000 direct suppliers, and these have further subcontractors and suppliers. And the relationships between these different companies are mixed, something we call plural forms of governance. Some are more market-based, some are more hierarchical-based, and some are relational. And what happens is that many lead firms actually lack a full picture of the whole supply network. And even if they have it, they're not transparent about their supply chains. And this, of course, is connected to severe responsibility concerns. A second reason is what political scientists call a regulatory gap. This means that not only lead firms have limited oversight over what goes on in their supply chains, but also that there isn't really a kind of world government that can regulate what goes on. Remember, escaping regulations was also one of the main motives for firms to actually increase the outsourcing and offshoring within their supply chains. A gap, of course, indicates that there are no regulations. This would not be the correct picture. Really, there are international organizations that set guidelines, e.g. regarding corporate responsibility, but typically these guidelines are non-binding. There are also trade agreements, which themselves are forms of regulations, and while some of them do contain so-called sustainability clauses, again, these are typically not binding. So some would say it is actually, given this regulatory gap, multinational corporations themselves that have to be in charge of responsibility and that have to become political actors, something that you have heard in the previous classes. This situation, of course, also creates complicated legal questions. For example, when we look at human rights violations along the supply chain, questions are who is responsible for these violations? The subcontractor running the factory or the retailer, the buyer, who did not do enough to ensure compliance with basic human rights standards? Which jurisdiction is applicable? The jurisdiction of the state where the factory is located or the jurisdiction of the state where the product is sold? So, as you will see, the regulation environment is not that the regulations are absent, but that given this global complexity, it is unclear especially which binding regulations we can draw on to enforce certain responsibility and sustainability standards. The third complexity stems from the increasingly complex and uncertain environment in which global supply chains operate. You may know the term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And indeed, given climate change, war, and an increasingly fragile world order, we can say that massive disruptions of global supply chains have become the norm rather than the exception. The Ever Given container ship stuck in the Suez Canal due to strong winds in March 2021 has become somewhat of a symbol image of climate-related disruptions of global supply chains. On the right-hand side, you see the collapsed Rana Plaza factory building in Bangladesh in April 2013, which has become a shocking and upsetting image and reminder of the human costs of today's form of global production, which again makes global supply chains prone to disruption. However, it must be noted that these risks are not necessarily exogenous to the behavior of global supply chains and multinational corporations in particular, but rather they're endogenous to the way they operate. In the remaining part of this lecture, I will talk about different avenues for managing these complexities. I want to distinguish three main avenues. First, via network management, what managers of lead firms in particular, but also of suppliers can do. Second, via private, so-called multi-stakeholder regulation involving corporations, but also civil society actors and trade unions and NGOs. And third, via public regulation. Let me start by introducing you to two basic modes of regulation. On the one hand, we have so-called hard regulation, binding regulation, regulation that stems from the law and that is typically exerted by public actors, typically nation states. But also industry associations and trade unions can be involved in developing binding regulations. Think, for example, about collective agreements for wages in a particular industry. The main mechanisms of hard regulations are, as mentioned, the law and sanctions that stem from disobeying the law, not complying with the law. And the mode of regulation here is authority-oriented. When we talk about global supply chains, a key example are recent developments related to supply chain due diligence regulations, such as the Loi de Vigilance in France, but also national civil laws, which have been used to make appeals on behalf of victims, for example, of factory disasters in global supply chains. On the other hand, we have so-called soft law. So these are regulations defined by private actors themselves to self-regulate the behavior of companies. Here, the main mechanisms are market-based. Soft law relies on incentives, on information, on moral appeals. And important examples are the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or the UN Global Compact, which not only provide information, but also a kind of moral and normative guidance to what would be appropriate behavior. When we look at the first path, the company-based managerial path, you have to think back of the first complexity of global supply chains that I've showed you in the slides before, and bear in mind the multiple relationships that need to be managed. Generally, we differentiate four main practices of network management. Practices of selecting suppliers, partners, allocating roles and responsibility, regulating, defining and setting rules, norms and standards, and evaluating the behavior of partners based on these rules, norms and standards. And of course, management can do certain things to increase the resilience and responsibility of their global supply chains. One example would be to reduce the number of subcontractors, thereby increasing oversight over the supply chain and making the supply chain therefore more amenable to resilience and responsibility. Another example would be to systematically evaluate not just performance indicators, but also social and environmental responsibility criteria, to systematically assess network-related risks in supply chain due diligence procedures and to include labor in due diligence processes, for example, as represented by global union federations. The second avenue, the form of private regulation, and in particular multi-stakeholder regulation, has been very important for making global supply chains more responsible and resilient for many years because of the absence of public and binding regulation that I have mentioned before. Many firms have here moved through a trajectory, starting with individual codes of conduct that they have unilaterally set them towards moving into these multi-stakeholder corporations with NGOs, but also when we talk about labor-related issues, in cooperation with global union federations, so that they have set themselves own standards, but also with the help of these external actors, made the compliance with these standards more binding. And a particularly interesting form of multi-stakeholder regulation has been the Accord for Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh that has been formed in response to the Rana Plaza factory disaster that I've mentioned before. And this initiative is notable because it not only has involved over 200 brands, but has also involved global union federations really as a contractual actor, so that these multiple parties have developed a contract, a binding, more or less binding kind of agreement that have obliged them to invest in building safety, monitor the building safety, audit the building safety, and fix building safety issues in Bangladesh so as to make the industry safer for workers. However, even the most ambitious multi-stakeholder initiatives, such as the Accord, have failed to systematically improve the responsibility of global supply chains. Because the agreement, the Accord, for example, was only drafted for a limited period of time and was only really focusing on one particular issue, the issue of building safety. This is why the third part and third avenue of regulation, the public path, is still absolutely important. And we have seen this in recent years in the form of human rights due diligence legislations. I already mentioned the French Loi de Vigilance, which have become necessary to hold especially multinational corporations leading global supply chains to account when it comes to certain standards, in this case, human rights standards. And here on the slide, you see the example of the German law on supply chain due diligence, a public agreement, public law that has come into force or will come into force after a long process of trying to pursue the private path of regulation based on the company's voluntary standard setting. But after careful evaluation by the German government, the conclusion has been drawn that the private initiatives have not been sufficient. And this is not surprising, again, as I mentioned, because of the intense competitive dynamics that we see in these global markets. This legislation will hold German multiple national corporations to account when it comes to monitoring the human rights and also some environmental risks along their supply chains. And while this law does not hold for all companies, it affects the largest companies, it is still one of the most ambitious or the most ambitious national legislation to date when it comes to providing a legal frame of action for making firms more responsible. I want to conclude with some summary reflections of how we can make global supply chains more resilient and responsible based on what I've just discussed. On the left side, we see the core risk factors, the fine-grained supply chain structures that I've shown you, resource dependencies that are created through supplier consolidation and through focusing on certain production locations, so-called outsourcing spirals and competency traps in which firms lose the capacity to react flexibly to market demands or to disruptions, and not least the systemic inequalities that we continue to see, in which workers at the end of global supply chains are still the ones most vulnerable and most exposed to risk, not just regarding labor exploitation, but also regarding the risks from environmental hazards. Now, here are some ideas of what can be done. First, the management perspective. Managers in lead firms, in key suppliers, can think about how they mix different modes of network governance and look really at the whole network to systematically monitor risks and responsibility concerns. A key part for making supply chains more responsible and therefore also more resilient is to look at purchasing practices and not just focus on the cheapest price, but to take additional factors, risk and responsibility related factors, into account. New technologies, of course, can help, such as additive manufacturing, in creating some redundancy and additional resources in global supply chains. And very importantly, global governance needs to be strengthened, not just in the form of collective action, multi-stakeholder agreements such as the Accord, but also when it comes to binding public regulation. It will be important to share responsibility for supply chain resilience and compliance with labor and environmental standards in industry-specific multi-stakeholder initiatives such as the Accord, as these have proven to be the most effective to date. And finally, firms need to develop regenerative strategies. That means not taking the social ecological systems in which global supply chains are embedded and on which they draw for granted, but to seriously invest in protecting and cherishing them. To sum up, here are some takeaway messages. First, states still have a key role to play in setting the rules of the game of the global economy. So global supply chains are therefore not just an economic, but also a political arena. Second, the current structure of global supply chains bears several risks for lead firms, suppliers, workers, consumers, and the planet, and these risks are unequally distributed. Third, resilience can be gained from taking a whole network's perspective on managing supply chains, involving stakeholders and developing industry-specific collective agreements that also will make supply chains more responsible. And finally, multinational corporations have already reevaluated their supply chains in response to recent disasters such as Rana Plaza or the COVID-19 pandemic, and they will certainly continue to do so. Thank you for listening, and please get in touch if you want to discuss something or give feedback to this class.